Hi, welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Martha Seelman, SAQA's Executive Director. SAQA stands for Studio Art Quilt Associates. We're a membership organization of artists and other professionals who are passionate about the art quilt. And we're one of 4 organizations that are organizing these textile talks. Today, I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce you to Laura Petrovich-Cheney. Laura has been creating really fascinating, wonderful art quilts out of wood for a little over 11 years. And she's going to tell you about her artistic journey and how she went from creating in fabric to creating primarily in wood. So Laura, take it away.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be a part of the Textile Talks. Since COVID, I've been watching these, and here I am giving one. So this is absolutely wonderful. Today, I'm coming from the traditional territory of the Namkeg tribe, which is also known as Marblehead, Massachusetts. So in this lecture, I'm going to answer 3 questions for you. How did I come up with the idea? Where did I get my wood? And how did I make these sculptures, and what inspires me? 3 questions that I'm asked all the time that I'm going to share this with you now. Before I get started, I just want to say, yes, I do fabric quilts. I make quilts for friends and family. The first quilt is on the left. I made that when I was about 17 years old. I had no idea how to sew, but I really wanted an antique quilt, and my mother would not buy me one. So I decided in my stubbornness that I will make my own. And I did. Really thrilled. I've made them for several years now. And again, they're all functional pieces that I use. So how did I come up with this idea of a wood quilt? Really, it came to me standing in a grocery store line. Like so many ideas, when our brain is at rest and we go on that automatic mode at the grocery store, the shower, vacuuming, whatever, ideas can kind of slip in. We're relaxed and open to new thoughts. And honestly, I was standing at the grocery store and poof, eureka, there it was. But before I give you how that happened, let me back up, because obviously there were some seeds planted in my imagination before my eureka moment. My background is in fine arts. I went to Dickinson College and I made a stained glass window, which is, I guess, pretty similar to some of the wood quilts, putting together small pieces. But I was mostly interested in figure drawing. That's where I excelled. And since I loved sewing, I thought, ooh, I should be a fashion designer. So I went to go get my master's degree at Dickinson. And I was a designer in a maternity company in Philadelphia. And again, 2 years in New York, I was designing clothing. But it was a tough business, and one that I found out that I wasn't really suited for. So I decided to go into teaching. And I really enjoyed teaching a lot. But I was a little jealous of my students because they were always being creative and expressing themselves. And I wanted to do that too. And not necessarily in drawing anymore, but maybe something different. So I decided in my mid-40s to go back to graduate school, again in Philadelphia at Moore College of Art. And one of the first assignments on the weekend there was that I had to write a memoir about a living artist who is influencing me right now and why. I was a little frustrated because I thought, well, if I really knew who was influencing me, I might not be here in graduate school to learn about contemporary art and contemporary artists. So I started where I was. As a school teacher, I loved and admired Faith Ringgold. As a quilter, I loved and admired her as well. So she seemed to be the perfect fit. I read her memoir, and what really struck me was she talked about how she was painting in a French Impressionistic style. And she brought these French Impressionistic paintings to New York and was completely rejected. A gallerist there told her, who was she to paint these? It was a negative comment that Faith had turned around and made into a really positive one. It gave Faith an opportunity to reflect on who she was and what would influence her. And in a way, I did the same thing. And that's what I wrote my essay on. I looked back at what was influencing me, and I lived in a town called Haddonfield, New Jersey, that was founded by a 16-year-old woman. She had inherited the land from her father, and her father was not able to go and get and take ownership of it. So he sent her from England to the New World at 16. It was remarkable. It was even remarkable that a 16-year-old woman could own property. So we always kind of grew up with this bravado of Elizabeth Haddon. On my way back and forth to school, as I learned about history and other things in grammar school that we do, but that lesson about Lizzie Haddon really stuck with me. But on my way back and forth to school was my favorite shop called The Little Shop. And they had quilt fabrics in there. And I always loved that idea. I also am close to Philadelphia, and at the Reading Terminal Market, the Amish and the Mennonite women would frequently exhibit and sell their quilts. So the idea of quilts was always part of my vernacular growing up. My grandmother was also a huge influence. She sewed, crocheted, knitted, and needlepoint. And like so many women in our history, she was an anonymous maker. I don't know how much she valued her work. She didn't value it enough to teach it to me. Sadly, she was an amazing artist in her own right. And just like I said, so many women don't put their names to it, and their work wasn't valued. And that really bothered me a great deal because I loved my grandmother's work. I still have the blanket that she gave me that she had crocheted. And to me, I felt an affinity to all these women through the ages whose work was undervalued and undernoticed. So at graduate school, I started to think very differently about my drawings. I was interested in textures like this slate floor that I did rubbings and washings with. And I was interested in a large scale. And I started to work like a quilter on the floor again, instead of on a wall drawing. And it was real physical, and I liked that physicality. Then I had to make stretchers for this work because I just couldn't hang them on the wall. So my professor taught me some woodworking. Now, you're not going to make stretchers with a chainsaw. So I had to learn first on a bandsaw. And when he took me down to the wood shop, I completely panicked. I mean, these were instruments of extreme danger. My father always told me never get near any of these things. And here I am going to cut something. I was so terrified that I was physically shaking. And my professor said, step back, take a breath. I can get through this, and I will. And I did not like being afraid of anything. That to me was a sign of weakness, and I wanted to get over it, that uncontrollable fear where I would shake. I had to conquer that. So I decided that I would work with wood during graduate school. And my graduate thesis, I'd actually worked so well with the woodworking machines that I decided to learn how to chainsaw. And my pieces were these large sculptures that you could walk into like a dress or a skirt. And that's what I had done in graduate school. One of my other projects was very similar to quilting. Now you're looking at this going, oh boy, how is that similar? Let me show you a close-up. These were trees that I had collected. I was walking in the woods and collecting branches. Being outside really is one of my favorite places in the world. And I decided to use these wooden branches that were all over the place. I'd collect them in the woods. I'd collect them on the beach, larger pieces of driftwood. At the time I was living in Asbury Park, New Jersey, so a lot of wood could wash up. And how is it similar to quilting is that I would take the tree branches and cut them into discs, and I would cut hundreds of them. And then I would put them on a machine called a drill press that makes a hole in them. And then I would thread them on a piece of metal wire. And that was so much like sewing, that you cut your shapes to sew, and then you thread needles. And I was threading wood, and I would rest the threaded rod into a root system and hang them. And the process is what makes it like a quilt. And it was so comforting to repeat cutting shapes 100 times and threading them like you would a needle. And it was so satisfying. Like I said, I'd been collecting a lot of the wood for this project on my walks with the dog. And with the dog, you know, you have to do a ton of walking, especially when they're young. And I live at the Jersey Shore. And although this is the MTV version, most of the Jersey Shore people, when they come, are more like the photograph on the right. They rent crabbing boats, they go out, they have a good time. And it was one of these crabbing boats that had washed up on the shore after a pretty nasty nor'easter. It was this turquoisey blue, a little similar to the wood boat there. And it was also orange. I think there were two of them, or I don't really remember. There was either two of them or one was turquoise on the inside and orange on the out. So anyhow, I had no plans for these boats, but it was the color that was so beautiful. And even though the colors of the tree limbs were gorgeous, these boats really caught my eye. So they sat in my studio for about a year after graduation, and I had no idea what I was going to do with them. And here we are back at the grocery store. So I had enjoyed cutting pieces that had, you know, kind of triggered my quilt making ideas. And I had these gorgeous turquoise boat in my studio. And here I am in the grocery store, and I see in the magazine rack while I'm in line, quilting. And I thought, oh gosh, I haven't, like, decorating with quilts, making a quilt to decorate with, something catchy like that. And I thought, oh, I haven't quilted in a while. Christmas is coming. I need to make some gifts. So let me see what's new. And I opened the page to this. And this turquoisey blue was the exact same color of the boat. And so I bought that magazine. I ran home. I did not make any fabric quilts that Christmas. Instead, I made this. And I couldn't believe it. That blue really had inspired me to make this traditional Lincoln's platform quilt. I was thrilled. I started making more wood quilts. Here's a 3" by 3" square, and you can see there's a boat sticker in there. This piece is 45 by 45, and it had been accepted into a museum. My other work was getting into exhibits, and I was so thrilled. Now, I didn't have a lot of wood. And if you look at the stamp, the date stamp on that photograph, that's January of 2012. And I'm thinking, well, you know, if I run out of this boat wood, I had a good run, I'll come up with another idea. But I am getting anxious because I love doing the work. I'm thinking, how am I ever going to find wood? So, which leads me to my next question. Where do I get the wood? And am I ever going to run out? Oh my. In October of 2012, one of the worst hurricanes hit New Jersey, and that was Hurricane Sandy. I won't give you the details of how bad it was, other than that it had changed my life. And one of the reasons why I do this work is because it had affected my life so much. And it made me more empathetic to everybody else that experiences natural disasters. We will all at some point live with an unplanned environmental disaster, some sort of catastrophe that happens that will change our lives. And so I do this work to kind of find comfort after surviving that. And I'm so appreciative to give this presentation because we are at the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. All these pictures are mine, except for the one at the lower left. That's quite the iconic photograph of Hurricane Sandy. My parents' house was affected. My house was affected. We had lived without electricity for a month. It was like a really bad camping trip. A couple of trees had fallen in on my house, but no serious damage. However, my parents' house was nearly completely destroyed. The whole first floor had to be gutted, and the whole surrounding community looked like this. So my drive from Asbury Park to Toms River, where my parents' house was littered with these kinds of homes. Here's a photograph of my father when he was renovating the house, and these stickers were all over the house, reminding people that they were uninhabitable for months. Like, the people at Fort Myers are just, I understand and appreciate what they're going through. It's horrible. And even if you never lived through a hurricane, you might at some point experience fires or flooding or drought. And these catastrophes affect our lives so much. Here's another photograph closer to my parents' house. And so I was able to collect the wood from these disasters. People would eventually get back into their homes. Front end loaders came and cleaned up them. The wood was then placed into large empty parking lots because they couldn't get the tractor trailers filled fast enough to empty out the wood. And as people came back into their houses, they would begin the renovations, gutting the kitchen, tearing down the screen porch, throwing out the furniture. And this is what I collected. In the picture on the right is me in my 10 by 10 storage unit. I'm holding up a photograph of a kitchen cabinet. And I would just ask people when they were cleaning up, hey, could I take your wood? They thought I was going to burn the wood because I would get questions like, what are you doing with it? I'm like, no, I'm not burning it. I know we don't have electricity at this moment, but I'm not burning it. I'm collecting. I'd tell them what I would do. And oftentimes people would be so thrilled that their memories from that kitchen were not going into a landfill, that I was reusing them to tell the story of Hurricane Sandy. So often people would help me load up my cart, and I would hear their stories about how they bought the house when they were in their 20s and now their grandchildren would inherit it, or it's been passed down in the family. People were just so sad to see the destruction happen that they were thrilled that a piece of their lives would be told and the memories would be shared in my work. So the third question is, how do I make these quilts? Now, I'd like to dispel the myth that these are quilts. Quilts are supposed to have 3 layers: a backing, a batting, and the patchwork top. And I have all of that. My backing is this whiteboard that you see with the grid marks on it, a 3-inch by 3-inch grid. My batting is the glue, that's the middle layer, and I do the patchwork. And I do consider them quilts. Here's kind of an improv log cabin. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with the spaces in between the log cabins, so I kind of improvised a lot of that. I used the grid system to help keep my lines straight. This is a photograph of my studio. The table that you see here is an old-fashioned design table. I had bought it from the company that I worked in Philadelphia. They were switching to digital cutting as opposed to hand cutting, or like laser cutting they'd switched to. So their old-fashioned tables could no longer function with the automatic cutting. So I purchased them. It's 48 inches wide by 96 inches long, and it's super sturdy. You can see all these irons here, these antique irons I'll talk about in a little bit, but this is the space that I work in. These are my favorite tools. The bandsaw is the one that's most similar to the sewing machine. Both work on a wheel system, and the bandsaw cuts the wood through a line with, the saw on it, whereas the sewing machine puts the pieces together with the needle, but it's that same undulating motion that makes them similar. I cut my larger, well, I'll show you in the video, but the miter saw, I use a table saw, a belt sander, and most importantly, a filtration system. Safety is sexy. You're going to see in the video that I have my hair pulled back, but I don't have my ears or my respirator. My ears are these wonderful contraptions here like this. They protect my ears pretty much, not only because the machines are making so much noise, but also the filtration systems are really noisy. And I always have those on, particularly when I'm sanding. And I have my respirator as well. This is for heavy duty dusting and sanding. So this one really keeps me really safe. Sometimes if I'm just sanding one piece real quick, I'll just wear a bandana. So I'll have a bandana here and just pull it up, pull it down, pull it up all day long. But in the video, you won't see that. And my hair is always pulled back. I don't wear any big earrings, necklaces, rings, or anything like that, because that is so important when you're woodworking. So let's take a look at the video here. So what I'm going to show you right here in my studio is how I work. Just like a quilter has yardage of fabric, I have wood material, and this right here is a 1x4. But this 1x4 is a little too big to put on my bandsaw. So I'm going to show you how I make this smaller by bringing it over to my miter saw. Let's take a walk over. So this is my miter saw, and this pink contraption here keeps the dust at a minimum for me. So I've already measured this before, and I'm going to just cut this down into a smaller, more workable piece. Okay, so now I have a much more workable piece, and what I do now is I use material like a quilter's ruler and this other ruler. If you're a quilter, you know these things are so important in what you do, and they are for me as well, because these are wood quilts. So I'm going to measure my lines here. And now we're going to go over to the bandsaw. Okay, so here we are, and this is my favorite machine. This is the one I use mostly. So we're going to cut these pieces down. Tossing the pieces that I don't need into my scrap pile so I can use them for later. Now these edges are kind of rough, so now I'm going to sand them on my sander. So I have the blue pieces cut, and I'm going to line them up to the piece that was already cut from before and check my work. And they should fit if my measurements are correct. And I'm noticing here that I do have to take a little bit off the blue, maybe just a resanding instead of a recutting, but that's it. So the old adage, measure twice, cut once, works every time. So I hope that you can see how enjoyable it is to work, how similar it is to quilting. And again, just to give you a review, this is the bandsaw, and you can see that I've split the pieces. And if I was sewing, the throat is exactly the same. I just put the pieces together, and you can see how unbelievably familiar it was. In the lower left corner is the sanding, and I think of the sanding a lot like ironing. It cleans up the edges. It doesn't press them nicely, but it smooths them out nicely later for gluing. So those two operations are extremely similar. And the batting. The batting is what holds it together. I'm not sewing them together, I'm gluing them, but it's that layer. And I use a 2-part resin just because it's really efficient for me. You've noticed a lot of the antique irons that I use to wade to all the time. When I was sewing clothing, you don't want to pin your clothing because it makes bubbles, and it could put holes in really expensive fabric. So you would have these cutting weights, and the cutting weights at the time were very expensive when I was going to school at Drexel. So I found antique irons, which at the time were only like $1 or $2. And I started collecting a lot of them. And I would use those as my weights when I cut fabric. Well, when I glue, you also need weight to make the contact between the layers that you're gluing together. And I can't always get in the middle of my work because it's 45 inches and there's no clamp that could extend that large. So I came up with these idea of metal irons to weigh the pieces down, which to me is just so funny that I'm ironing wood. This is that piece that you saw in the video, Homesick. When I was making masks during the pandemic, I was watching Jenny from Missouri Star Quilt Company. Her videos would just go out on loop after I saw the one on how to make a mask. And I saw this one that she was making of tiny houses. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm home. A lot of us are sick at home. Some of us are not. But I also named it Homesick because I had missed my childhood home that had been destroyed. So it had such double meaning for me of where I was at the present moment of being stuck at home and how I was missing, my parents' shore house. Another title was another idea that came from me. It's a reaction to the event of Sandy. It was called Trifecta. There were 3 events that happened during the hurricane. It was a hurricane, a cyclone, and 2 days later, a snowstorm. And this was the last of the boat registration sticker that I had. So I put it on here to kind of commemorate that event. Sometimes I'll sketch out other ideas. This is kind of a riff on a log cabin quilt with the center square and then building diagonals around it. I actually had not intended it to be that way. I imagined that here I was, a little house, and I was cornered in the little house in these larger lots. And so I drew it that way. And you can see on the right-hand side, the sketch has the small square in the upper right, and then there were diagonal pieces. But when I started to cut that and lay it out, it looked really odd. So I just intuitively started working and literally playing with blocks. And I came up with the idea that it felt more comfortable as a 4-cornered log cabin kind of thing. Really fun to kind of play on the fly. You always have to be in touch with your intuition when you're working and ask yourself, is this working? Do I feel good making this? Or is there something kind of funny about it? This is the detail of cornered. You can see the various elevations in the wood. It's kind of a topography that shows the undulation. Cedar siding is real thin, but perhaps the screen door that I'm using is thicker. And I love that variation. To me, it becomes very sculptural and kind of mimics the variation of the quality of quilting. You know, when you, especially in hand quilting, you can really make some beautiful undulations with quilting. And my thickness of wood kind of mimics that. Other ideas and inspirations come from poetry. I did not realize how much I read poetry until I needed titles of work. This is a line from a John O'Donoghue blessing. He was an Irish poet that I discovered through friends of mine, but he's also on a podcast called On Being, when it was called Speaking of Faith. And the line is Meadow of Delight. And I was inspired by that poem that he had written, or that blessing as he called them. Inspiration can come from Instagram. I'm a huge purveyor of Instagram. I love it more than Facebook. I don't have to interact so much. It's a very visual medium. I took a class during COVID, and I really enjoyed translating this challenging quilt into wood. I could not iron down those corners as you could with fabric, so this was really hard. One of my favorite quilters is Kay Fassett, and I was blessed enough to be in an exhibit with him called Pattern Pieces at the James Michener Museum. He and I are photographed here. I find his quilts to be inspirational, and as a person, him and Brandon are quite wonderful people. This was Brandon Mabley Instagram post of a bed quilt that they had constructed, or a friend had constructed. I'm not sure of the story, but visually I fell in love with it and made it into a kind of riff on that as well. I'd like to take the moment to thank Carolyn at the International Quilt Museum and her staff. One of another highlights of my career was my solo exhibit, Memory and Material, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Another quilt that I'm so proud of, that I loved so much, was doing the star quilt, and it was inspired by Dr. Maya Angelou's quote, "Nothing can dim the light which shines from within." And this was the last piece I made. It was in February, March of 2020, and we were listening to stories of COVID and lockdowns in Italy, and I had a friend that was living in Italy, and we were texting back and forth what it was like, and I just sort of sent out that light that we all needed, that we carry within us, that the world would still be a good place to be in, regardless of what our future held for us. This one is In Your Eyes. I love this piece because it sort of is an optical illusion. It's just weird visual stuff that happens. It also looks like a COVID cell, a kaleidoscope, and kind of mirrors that time that we lived in. This is an older piece, a pre-pandemic. I tried my hand at the 8-star quilt. What quilter hasn't tried to tackle a star? Oh my goodness, let me tell you, it was a real challenge. In the bottom right-hand side, that's my backing board. I painted the gray spots to be red so I could focus in on where I need it to be. Boy, it was a challenge. Here's a really, really close-up picture of it, and it shows all the imperfections, that the lines don't match up, that there are little spaces in between each one. And my work is a constant reminder that nothing is perfect. I'm not perfect, the world isn't perfect, but somehow we all come together broken, lost, beat up, worn out, and when we're all together and work together, that imperfections become so beautiful. It's sort of like the living act of hope. This is a more recent piece. I do work in I will batch cut a whole bunch of pieces. You know, when you take, when you fold your fabric 4, 5, 6, maybe even 10 times to cut those triangles or squares, because you just need a lot of them. I'll do the same. I'll batch cut triangles, in this case, at infinitum. These were my base colors. I did leave some room to pop in some other, and if you look closely, you'll see that there are only 4 reds, only 1 pink, and a few brighter blues in between. I love doing those pops of color, but to do that, I had to know what my base colors were. Another one of those antique irons. Let me tell you, if sewing on a straight line is a challenge, gluing on a straight line is an equal challenge. So I take a 2x4, place it down, weight it down, and back up my work to it. A lot of my work, like I mentioned before, will change as the idea. This one is called Constellations. It's a newer piece that I'd worked on. I was fascinated by the new Hubble, not the Hubble telescope, but the new pictures from space that we had seen of the universe beyond our Milky Way. Kind of blew my mind. So I did a whole bunch of new star quilts inspired by that experience. And I was going to get way more detailed with like little 1-inch squares between these large stars. And I thought, oh, no, 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 no. That would be a visual too much, just too much. So I pared it down as much as I could. But you only do that when you start creating the piece. What happens in a sketchbook doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in reality. my version of a crazy quilt. These are 12 inches by 12-inch pieces, and they are all the scraps of the scraps of the scraps. I throw nothing away. And so I saved all these pieces. And when I realized that I had more milk crates and boxes of the little scraps, I came up with that idea. It's a great piece to install because it can be the iteration of it can be changed to the location of or how the space is and whatever location it is. So in this case, it was very linear. At the New England Quilt Museum, it was more square-like. To give you an idea of the scale that I work on, I'm 5'8", and the piece behind me with all the triangles is 3 feet by 3 feet. The one in the middle is 18 by 36. And the one on the far right is 24 by 24. The largest that I've ever worked is 5 feet by 5 feet. And that is the size of the wood that I could get. Usually I like 36 by 30 or 36 inch by 36 inch or 30 by 30 because it's what I could carry, it's what I can hang. But I do 4 feet by 4 feet as well. And the last side that I'd like to share with you has some non-hurricane wood in it. As quilters, you know, when you get a little tired of your fabric, you decide to make some swaps with the Quilt Guild or with a friend. So there's this California artist who's a painter and a woodworker. And I texted her one day because I fell in love with some of her bright colors. And I said in a text message to her, I said, Poppy, would you like to do a fabric exchange with wood? And she was so into it. So I'm so grateful to Poppy Dodge to go down that rabbit hole with me and exchange some wood pieces. I mailed her some of mine. She mailed me some of hers. And it really kind of invigorated some of my wood. She does paint her salvaged wood. She collects the wood and paints it. I, on the other hand, do not. But this piece was just so fun since her colors were so much crisper than mine, since mine were older and had gone through the process of a hurricane. So it had really had given me some good inspiration. So that finishes it up for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for staying with me and going on this journey. I'd love to answer some questions now, and hopefully you have some.
Great. Thank you so much. It's fun to watch it all again and just see how it evolved and changed over time. There's a quick question here. What was the name of the wood artist that you did the swap with?
Poppy Dodge.
Mm-hmm. And that feeds into a question that a couple of different people asked, which is about using the wood as you find it or enhancing it by painting it yourself. And you said that you do not paint any of the wood.
I do not paint it. And, you know, I have a piece here with me. I love this piece. Look at this, a Hannah Montana sticker. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
I don't paint the wood. This is a dresser that I'd found on the streets after the hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
It had purple drawers and pink. You can't imagine how much mileage I can get from a dresser. And I just sort of cut it down. I use it as it is. I will, you know, fancy cut out the Hannah Montana, just like all of us would do with a great motif on a fabric. And I don't paint it. I don't touch it. All I do is take out the nails and that's it. The nail holes I love. If it's scraped, that's wonderful. If it's not, that's fine too. I usually will take a Clorox wipe and kind of get some of the dust and grime off of it, but not always. One time there was a fantastic muddy footprint on one of the wood pieces and I left it and it was going somewhere. And I said, would you like me to clean? I'd exhibited it with the muddy footprint at a gallery. And the person who bought it, I said, do you want me to clean that up? I can. They're like, no, we love it. Leave it. Things like graffiti on the wood or stickers, totally leave, but I don't paint any of the wood.
So there are a couple other questions. One I thought was really lovely. She said, I found it interesting, the contrast between the wood, which comes from disaster, loss, and tragedy, and the beautiful designs that you turn it into. do you or did you feel a lot of those sentiments and emotions when you were making those first pieces? You know, you've said that it was a way of dealing with the loss of your family's home.
Yeah, it really was a huge loss, especially in the years and the months right afterwards. Obviously, I wasn't making anything for the first couple of months because we just had no electricity for a month in Asbury Park. But during the time of going back and forth to the shore house, my parents lived in Philadelphia, and my dad would go back to the shore and back, and it was like an hour and a half ride each way. He actually had died a few months after Hurricane Sandy, and during the process, it was just too much on him, and he had passed away. And my mother passed away a few months after him. So the loss was a double indemnity. Not only did I lose my childhood home, but I lost both my parents. And so that kind of collective loss really helped when I was making the quilts, because I couldn't necessarily process everything that was happening. It just seemed so chaotic. The world was chaotic and messy, and my life was filled with grief, but I had such total control over this 3-foot square. And just like so many quilters, you can control that. And there it is. It's just order. It makes sense. It's logical. And that's what those quilts provided. And they keep providing that kind of release for me as we go through pandemics and political upheavals and everything that's happening to the world. Here it is in this little studio. I have autonomy. I am the queen of this space, and I control it. And that gives me a lot of inner peace and comfort.
Mhm. There are a couple other questions about process.
Mhm.
One that's popped up several times is, because you're working with reclaimed wood, do you have concerns about lead paint being used on these older pieces of wood?
Absolutely. It is a concern because I know if the houses were painted before 1977, they did use lead paint. One of the things that I do is I have my very sexy respirator here. This helps a lot. So when I'm cutting the pieces and I'm working on those and sanding them, they're here. I have 2 filtration systems going that also helps eliminate the particles that are airborne as well. Once the wood is cut, it stops emanating as long as it's, no one's picking at it and chipping it and things of the sort. And so that is what I do to mitigate the dangers of the lead. I know that it's in there. You can also smell it right away. If I don't know how old the wood is, I can cut it instantly and it smells minty. So that's the key. As soon as that happens, it's done. I just put on the respirator and we go.
Mhm. Yeah, and somebody asked, sort of as a follow-up, when you're creating these wood quilts, are you shellacking or otherwise sealing the wood after you glue it down?
No, no. I vacuum them all out. So any of the real pieces that sort of might be half flaking off do come off after the vacuum process. I have 2 shop vacs actually. And one of them has, I know I have a lot of vacuums. One of the shop vacs has an attachment to it that is a fuzzy piece. It's a brush. So I absolutely brush off anything that has the potential to flake.
Mhm.
So that removes that issue. And
Mhm.
there's always, when someone purchases a piece, I tell them exactly how to dust it. Just use a light feather cloth on it. Don't use any, no Windex or wood stuff, just a light feather duster.
Mhm. And then the other technical question is, what kind of wood glue or epoxy are you using to adhere the layers?
Oh, that's a great question. When I first started, the wood glue was a problem. I was using traditional wood glue. And because the boats had gone through so much damage, they'd absorbed a lot more wood water, and they couldn't take any more. And I was not able to get them to stick to the board. I would sand them and they would
Mhm.
pop off. So it took a little while and I could not find the answer. I tried to nail them and it just didn't look right. So I figured, well, they were boats, so why not go to a boat store and ask them how to repair a wood boat? It seemed to make sense. And I went to a place called West Marine, and the gentleman there said, oh, sure, yeah, this two-part resin system. And so that's what I use. It's odorless. I mean, I'm sure if I drank it, it would be toxic. There's no doubt, but I'm not ingesting it. So, again, it's
Mhm.
ventilated. It's odorless. Some people said it smells, but I haven't smelled it. So my room is large enough and it's fine. It's what I use, not Gorilla Glue or anything like that. They have a tendency to foam up and make too many spaces, but a two-part
Mhm.
resin system is what I love.
Okay. Well, yeah, my father, who was a woodworker, was a big proponent of the two-part resin systems. I wanted to talk a little bit um, about the title of your solo exhibition at the International Quilt Museum, Memory and Material, which I think is such a perfect title for your work. And in coming up with the next design that you're going to work on, you showed how you're getting your inspiration from a number of traditional quilt patterns or non-traditional quilt patterns. Um, how much is the memory of where the wood came from still an important part of your art, or are you now just being inspired by a variety of things?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mostly still have Hurricane Sandy wood. So that'll always be part of it. And especially since I'd lost my the family home and my parents, that will always be part of this story. It's now other parts of my story. When we'd bought this house in
Mhm.
Massachusetts, I'd renovated it. It was from the 1860s. So I took wood from that. And some of my neighbors renovated, every community kind of renovated after the pandemic. We all were stuck at home and decided, well, now's a good time.
Mhm.
So I would take things from them. And now I tell my neighbors, well, your kitchen is in this piece or your
Mhm.
dresser is in this piece.
Mhm.
So for me, that kind of memory becomes our collective memory of a time when these pieces were made. And I'll always look at it, whether or not it's important for the world to know. I don't know how important that is, but for me as the maker, that memory is still vital. And I keep a journal in my sketchbook of those things. Like
Mhm.
this was mostly used from Marblehead wood, or this wood was mostly used from Ortley Beach. And so for me, it's important. And I think that the material speaks for itself, and that when you look at the pieces, you realize that it is old, that it was from a cabinet or a dresser. And that's what's important, that it's communicated, that it belonged to somebody else.
And so do you take commissions from people who are demolishing a house or a kitchen or whatever and say, we'd love to have you make something with our wood?
I have twice. Somebody lost their Adirondack chairs in Martha's Vineyard, and they
Okay.
hated throwing them out. Could you do anything with these? And I said, I certainly can. I certainly can. So, and the other one, I was scheduled to take some of the family barn wood, but when the barn had been demolished, it had turned out that they had over, I don't know, let's just say a lot of colonies of bats. And we decided
Oh.
that it wouldn't be a good idea to touch that wood. So I lost that commission, sadly. And that leads me to another question that I get is, how do you deal with, insects and things of the sort?
Mhm.
I can,
Termites.
yeah, it's a great question. I can cherry pick my wood. So if I pick out a wood and I see it has termite holes or something real gnarly in it, I don't use it. I have enough that I can choose from, that I don't have to mitigate it. There are certain things that you can do. You can dry it, put it in a dry kiln or in a dry space and just let the bugs go at it. There's some, I don't know, foam sprays that get released over time. I'm not messing with that. I have
Mhm.
enough if it's that infested, it's gone. Same thing with mold. If it's a little tiny bit of mold, I can sweep it off, I can sand it off, but if it's completely infested, it's gone. I don't need to deal with it.
Mhm. I've got another technical question that just came in.
Sure.
What are you using as your backing board?
Ah, yes, the backing boards. I use either Baltic birch or red oak. They're really strong. I wish sometimes it's 1/4 of an inch, sometimes it's 3/8 of an inch, sometimes never more than that because it can get so heavy. A 1/2 inch is way too much. So like 3" to 1/4 is pretty good. And that's what I use as my backing. And I use the Baltic birch and the red oak because it's really strong. They're very
Mhm.
strong woods. They tend to be very flat. They are a little bit more expensive because they're what they would put on the outside of a cabinet to avoid the warping. So that's what I use.
Mhm.
And I
Go
do
ahead.
prime those and paint those. And sometimes on my back, if I've got some time, I'm not like in a rush to finish the work, I'll paint them bright colors, just much like a quilt will have a little surprise on the back.
Mhm.
So I'll go to the big box stores or the paint stores, pick up their little quarts of dollar mix match
Mhm.
colors, and I'll paint them bright yellow, a purple, a blue on the back,
Mhm.
just because they are quilts and the back should be addressed properly.
Mhm. I've got one last question,
Oh,
which is somebody asking about why focus on their quilt-like nature rather than simply calling them sculptures.
and yeah, I know. I always get that. Um, they are sculptures. And I suppose it's the community of which I'm addressing. If I was doing this lecture for a sculpture group, I may tend to call them more sculptures.
Mhm.
This is a quilt-based group, so they are quilts, but in my heart, they'll always still be quilts because that was my first love. That's
Mhm.
what I love to do, the physicality of sewing, laying the quilts out on a table or on a floor. So for me, I think it's just my personal interest and my personal love that makes me call them quilts instead of sculpture.
Mhm.
But when I have to check off that box, what are they? Sculptures, because I make them with woodworking tools. They're 3-dimensional, even though they hang on a wall. I'm influenced by a lot of female artists, in particular Lee Bonteque, who did wall sculptures as well. So yeah, but
Mhm.
my heart, there's the quilts.
Okay, well, that's a good answer. And finally, what's next for you?
What's next? My first art fair is coming up. I decided to have a little booth at the other art fair in Brooklyn. That
Mhm.
happens the first week in November. So I'll be in New York for a week. And then I have 2 shows next summer. They're large shows. Each one needs about 30 pieces. 50,
Wow.
I should say 20 to 30 pieces for each one. They're a 2-person show. So that's what's on. It's a lot of wood. It's a lot of work. I've got to make like
Yeah.
60 pieces because if they're asking for 25, they want to see at least 50. So I'll be really busy, and that's what I'm doing. My last solo show was at the New England Quilt Museum, and I kind of didn't want to take on a solo show for a while, but somehow I found more work and
Mhm.
have a busy summer coming up.
Yeah. So the Brooklyn art fair is called the Other
The other
Art
fair.
Fair. So you can look that up online, and I'm sure if you check out Laura's website, which is in the chat, you can also find all the information about that and about the upcoming exhibitions. Thank you so much, Laura. This was fabulous. Really interesting to see how your ideas grew, morphed, developed, changed, and just to see all of the different kinds of designs that you have created. I think my favorite still is all the little houses. It's just a marvelous piece. I want to invite everybody to join us next week when the Quilt Alliance will be doing a wonderful interview as part of their Quilters Save Our Stories series of interviews. I hope that you will register and attend. It should be really fabulous. And if you are enjoying Textile Talks, please consider making a small gift to help us be able to continue to offer this series to you. It's great to see everybody here. Thank you again, Laura. Have a great day.
Thank you.